I am very delighted to be able to welcome to our part of the world one of the great writers and intellectuals of our time, Arundhati Roy. I was thinking on the way over here about what makes a really great writer, what makes a really great person, and what makes a really great rebel. Someone who listens. Someone who listens more than he or she talks. Someone who goes to find where the silence is and tries to understand why the silence is there. One of the most difficult things for me growing up, as someone considered poor, was to see how people assumed that if you didn't have voice, it meant that you were ignorant and that you were backward. And that is what happens to oppressed people, that they're just considered to be deserving of this because they're not quite as intelligent, they're not quite as smart, when usually what it is that they don't have the weapons that the people have who are doing the oppressing. So someone like Arundhati is so precious and so rare. I was just a couple of months ago in India and met her for the first time, she and her mother and her brother and her family. And it was like coming home, because these were people who were awake, who were wide awake. And I want you to know that she comes from a mother who has been awake for a very long time and who has built a school to make sure that generations are awake. So I'm wearing tonight this beautiful coat that I bought, which was always too small. But I bought it anyway because it comes from Kashmir. It comes from a place that Arundhati holds dear. It comes from a place that is under occupation by the Indian Army to the tune of 700,000 troops who are holding down the people. And when I was in India, one of the things I wanted to find out was, well, who are these people? What are they like? And it turns out that they're the people who make beautiful things. They make beautiful, beautiful rugs. They make beautiful jackets. They make beautiful furniture. They make beautiful pottery. They make beauty. And that is who is being held down. It's unbearable. It's hard for me ever to think of an artist thwarted in his or her work, in his or her passion. It's an impoverishment of the world when this happens. And so I hope that she will talk to us about the Kashmiri people and what their struggle is, so we know, so we have an idea, so we join. We join. Just as we wear our kafiyas, we wear our Kashmiri coats and our shawls. And it may seem a small thing, and yet beauty is so connective. Beauty is the thing that is inexhaustible, ever elastic, all-encompassing, and that connects us. And then we learn what we can do anywhere in the world. So like Charles Dickens, like Charlotte Bronte, like Virginia Woolf, Victor Hugo, all these wonderful writers who we consider wonderful basically because they spoke in the language of writers to let us know what was happening to the people who had no voice. So Arundhati joins a really long and proud list of people who care deeply and who listen deeply and then who speak fearlessly. This is our salvation, this kind of writer, this kind of person. And I'm so delighted that you are here with all of your enthusiasm and your energy to welcome this very brave sister. Thank you.
Thank you. If I was going to say this in India, people would have been armed with lots of insults. So it's nice to get a standing ovation here before I start. Thank you so much for coming. And it's been many years since I've been to the United States. And these last years, I've spent almost all my time writing and traveling in India, but actually looking at what we've done to democracy. And now there isn't, I mean, somehow the more I work and the more I write, these words like India and America and Pakistan and Afghanistan become more and more meaningless, because it looks as though the elites of these countries have sort of seceded into outer space and made a country of their own, and the rest of us are left with our visas and passports and border controls. So I don't know how to use words like America and India and so on anymore with any degree of accuracy. So what I'll do, I'm going to just read a little bit from the introduction of my new book, and then I'm going to read an essay that I wrote about Kashmir. And then I'm going to talk with David. So this is called Democracy's Failing Light. While we're still arguing about whether there's life after death, can we add another question to the cart? Is there life after democracy? What sort of life will it be? By democracy, I don't mean democracy as an ideal or an aspiration. I mean the working model, Western liberal democracy and its variants such as they are. So is there life after democracy? Attempts to answer this question often turn into a comparison of different systems of governance and end with a somewhat prickly, combative defense of democracy. It's flawed, we say. It isn't perfect, but it's better than everything else that's on offer. Inevitably, someone in the room will say, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, is that what you would prefer? Whether democracy should be the utopia that all developing societies aspire to is a separate question altogether. I think it should, because the early idealistic phase can be quite heady. But the question about life after democracy is addressed to those of us who already live in democracies or in countries that pretend to be democracies. It isn't meant to suggest that we lapse into older, discredited models of totalitarian or authoritarian governments. It's meant to suggest that the system of representative democracy, too much representation and too little democracy, needs some structural adjustment. The question here really is, what have we done to democracy? What have we turned it into? What happens once democracy has been used up, when it has been hollowed out and emptied of meaning? What happens when each of its institutions has metastasized into something dangerous? What happens now that democracy and the free market have fused into a single predatory organism with a thin, constricted imagination that revolves almost entirely around the idea of maximizing profit? Is it possible to reverse this process? Can something that's mutated go back to being what it used to be? What we need today for the sake of the survival of this planet is long-term vision. Can governments whose very survival depends on immediate, extractive, short-term gain provide this? Could it be that democracy, the sacred answer to our short-term hopes and prayers, the protector of our individual freedoms and nurturer of our avaricious dreams, will turn out to be the end game for the human race? Could it be that democracy is such a hit with modern humans precisely because it mirrors our greatest folly, our nearsightedness, our inability to live entirely in the present like most animals do, combined with our inability to see very far into the future, makes us strange in-between creatures, neither beast nor prophet, Our amazing intelligence seems to have outstripped our instinct for survival. We plunder the earth, hoping that accumulating material surplus will make up for the profound, unfathomable thing that we have lost. As a writer, a fiction writer, I've often wondered whether the attempt to always be precise, to try and get it all factually right, somehow reduces the epic scale of what is really going on. Does it eventually mask a larger truth? I worry that I'm allowing myself to be railroaded into offering prosaic, factual precision, when maybe what we need is a feral howl, or the transformative power and real precision of poetry. But something about the cunning, Brahmanical, intricate, bureaucratic, file-bound, applied through proper channels, nature of governance and subjugation in India seems to have made a clerk out of me. My only excuse is to say that it takes odd tools to uncover the maze of subterfuge and hypocrisy that cloaks the callousness and the cold, calculated violence of the world's favorite new superpower. Repression through proper channels sometimes engenders resistance through proper channels. As resistance goes, this isn't enough, I know, but for now it's all I have. Perhaps someday it will become the underpinning for poetry and the feral howl. So, when I talk about democracy being hollowed out, I remember as a child, as a student in school, I once stole all the carrots from my Malayalam teacher's garden and planted the tops back. And for a long time, he kept watering them and wondering why it wasn't working out. And sometimes I think this is what's happened. You know, each of these institutions that's supposed to make up a democracy, the press, the courts, the parliament, all of them have been hollowed out. And we keep watering them, and we keep voting, and we keep hoping, but it keeps wilting further and further. So now I'm going to read an essay called Azadi. Azadi in Urdu means freedom. And this was written in August of 2008 when I was in Kashmir at the time of a huge popular uprising. I don't know how familiar you are with the Kashmir problem, but I'll just give you a small potted history. Kashmir was an independent kingdom at the in 1947 when India and Pakistan were partitioned at the time of independence. And both India and Pakistan tried to lay claim to Kashmir. At the time, the king was a Hindu king with a Muslim majority citizenry. And he fled basically from Srinagar to Jammu and then signed an accession deed which made Kashmir a part of India. But then the Pakistani army and some non-army people came in, and basically Kashmir is now divided between India and Pakistan. And since 1947, the people have struggled in Indian-occupied Kashmir for independence, and that struggle became an armed struggle in 1989. And to give you some idea of what's happening there, at the height of the conflict in Iraq, the US had 180,000 troops in Iraq. India has between 500 and 700,000 troops in the Kashmir Valley. It is the most militarized zone in the world. Dr. Angana Chatterjee, who's here, is part of a group of people who's trying to set up an international tribunal on the war crimes in Kashmir. So that's what this event is a benefit for. And the media in India just blanks out what's really going on there, not with silence, but with a lot of noise, telling a lot of lies. So here, when this piece came out, there were whole programs on TV called "Has Arundhati Roy Crossed the Line?" So anyway, For the past 60 days or so, since about the end of June, the people of Kashmir have been free. Free in the most profound sense. They have shrugged off the terror of living their lives in the gun sights of 500,000 heavily armed soldiers in the most densely militarized zone in the world. After 18 years of administering a military occupation, the Indian government's worst nightmare has come true. Having declared that the militant movement has been crushed, it is now faced with a nonviolent mass protest, but not the kind it knows how to manage. This one is nourished by people's memory of years of repression in which tens of thousands have been killed, thousands have been disappeared, hundreds of thousands tortured, injured, and humiliated. That kind of rage, once it finds utterance, cannot easily be tamed, rebottled, and sent back to where it came from. In fact, in the last few years, the report that you'll find outside talks about mass graves that have been uncovered in Kashmir, where 2,900 bodies have been found in 2,700 graves. So now, there are double-decker graves and triple-decker graves and so on. For all these years, the Indian state, known amongst the knowing as the deep state, has done everything it can to subvert, suppress, represent, misrepresent, discredit, interpret, intimidate, purchase, and simply snuff out the voice of the Kashmiri people. It has used money, lots of it, violence, lots of it, disinformation, propaganda, torture, elaborate networks of collaborators and informers, terror, imprisonment, blackmail, and rigged elections to subdue what Democrats would call the will of the people. But now the deep state, as deep states eventually tend to, has tripped on its own hubris and has bought into its own publicity. It made the mistake of believing that domination was victory, that the normalcy it had enforced through the barrel of a gun was indeed normal, and that the people's sullen silence was acquiescence. The well-endowed peace industry, speaking on behalf of the people, informed us that, quote, Kashmiris are tired of violence and want peace. What kind of peace they were willing to settle for was never clarified. Meanwhile, Bollywood's cachet of Kashmir/Muslim terrorist films has brainwashed most Indians into believing that all of Kashmir's sorrows could be laid at the door of evil, people-hating terrorists. To anybody who cared to ask, or more importantly, to listen, it was always clear that even in their darkest moments, people in Kashmir had kept the fires burning, and that it was not peace alone they yearned for, but freedom too. Over the last 2 months, the carefully confected picture of an innocent people trapped between two guns, both equally hated, has, pardon the pun, been shot to hell. A sudden twist of fate, an ill-conceived move over the transfer of nearly 100 acres of state forest land to the Amarnath Shrine Board, which manages the annual Hindu pilgrimage to a cave deep in the Kashmir Himalayas, suddenly became the equivalent of tossing a lit match into a barrel of petrol. Until 1989, the Amarnath pilgrimage used to attract about 20,000 people who traveled to the Amarnath cave over a period of about 2 weeks. In 1990, when the overtly Islamic militant uprising in the valley coincided with the spread of virulent Hindutva, which is the sort of Hindu equivalent of Islamism in the Indian plains, the number of pilgrims began to increase exponentially, and by 2008, more than 500,000 pilgrims visited the Amarnath cave in large groups, their passage often sponsored by Indian business houses. To many people in the valley, this dramatic increase in numbers was seen as an aggressive political statement by an increasingly Hindu fundamentalist Indian state. Rightly or wrongly, the land transfer was viewed as the thin edge of the wedge. It triggered an apprehension that it was the beginning of an elaborate plan to build Israeli-style settlements and change the demography of the valley. Days of massive protest forced the valley to shut down completely. Within hours, the protests spread from the cities to villages. Young stone pelters took to the streets and faced armed police who fired straight at them, killing several. For people as well as the government, it resurrected memories of the uprising in the early 90s. Throughout the weeks of protest, hartal, which is shut down, and police firing, while the Hindutva publicity machine charged Kashmiris with committing every kind of communal excess, the 500,000 Amarnath pilgrims completed their pilgrimage, not just unhurt, but touched by the hospitality they had been shown by local people. Eventually, taken completely by surprise at the ferocity of the response, the government revoked the land transfer. But by then, the land transfer had become a non-issue, and the protest spiraled out of control. Massive protests against the revocation erupted in Jammu, which is a Hindu-majority district just south of the Kashmir Valley. There, too, the issue snowballed into something much bigger. Hindus began to raise issues of neglect and discrimination by the Indian state. For some odd reason, they blamed Kashmiris for that neglect. The protests led to the blockading of the Jammu-Srinagar highway, the only functional road link between Kashmir and India. The army was called out to clear the highway and allow safe passage of trucks between Jammu and Srinagar. But incidents of violence against Kashmiri truckers were being reported from as far away as Punjab, where there was no protection at all. As a result, Kashmiri truckers, fearing for their lives, refused to drive on the highway. Truckloads of perishable fresh fruit and valley produce began to rot. It became very obvious that the blockade had caused the situation to spin out of control. The government announced that the blockade had been cleared and that trucks were going through. Embedded sections of the Indian media, quoting the inevitable intelligence sources, began to refer to it as a perceived blockade, and even suggested that there had never been one. But it was too late for these games. The damage had been done. It had been demonstrated in no uncertain terms to the people in Kashmir that they lived on sufferance, and that if they didn't behave themselves, they could be put under siege, starved, deprived of essential commodities and medical supplies. The real blockade became a psychological one, and the last fragile link between India and Kashmir was all but snapped. To expect matters to end there was, of course, absurd. Hadn't anybody noticed that in Kashmir, even minor protests about civic issues like water and electricity inevitably turned into demands for azadi? To threaten them with mass starvation amounted to committing political suicide. Not surprisingly, the voice that the government of India has tried so hard to silence in Kashmir has massed into a deafening roar. Hundreds of thousands of unarmed people have come out to reclaim their cities, their streets, and their mohallas, their neighborhoods. They simply overwhelmed the heavily armed security forces by their sheer numbers and with a remarkable display of raw courage. Raised in a playground of army camps, checkpoints, and bunkers, with screams from torture chambers for a soundtrack, the younger generation has suddenly discovered the power of mass protest, and above all, the dignity of being able to straighten their shoulders and speak for themselves, represent themselves. For them, it's nothing short of an epiphany. They're in full flow. Not even the fear of death seems to hold them back. And once that fear has gone, of what use is the largest or second largest army in the world? What threat does it hold? Who should know that better than the people of India who won their independence in the way that they did? The circumstances in Kashmir being what they are, it's hard for the spin doctors to fall back on the same old, to claim that it's all the doing of Pakistan's inter-service intelligence, or that people are being coerced by militants. Since the 30s, the question of who can claim the right to represent that elusive thing known as Kashmiri sentiment has been bitterly contested. Was it Sheikh Abdullah, the Muslim Conference? Who is it today? The mainstream political parties, the Hurriyat, which is the collection of sort of separatist leaders, the militants. This time around, the people are in charge. There have been mass rallies in the past, but none in recent memory that have been so sustained and widespread. The mainstream political parties of Kashmir, the National Conference and the People's Democratic Party, fated by the deep state and the Indian media despite the pathetic voter turnout in election after election, appeared dutifully for debates in New Delhi's TV studios, but cannot muster the courage to appear on the streets of Kashmir. The armed militants who, through the worst years of the repression, were seen as the only ones carrying the torch of Azadi forward, if they're around at all, seem content to take a back seat and to let the people do the fighting for a change. The separatist leaders who do appear and speak at the rallies are not leaders so much as followers, being guided by the phenomenal, spontaneous energy of a caged, enraged people that has exploded on Kashmir streets. The leaders, such as they are, have been presented with a full-blown revolution. The only condition seems to be that they have to do as the people say. If they say things that people do not wish to hear, they are gently persuaded to come out, publicly apologize, and correct their course. This applies to all of them, including Saeed Ali Shah Gilani, who he's one of the major leaders who's very pro-Pakistan, who at a public rally recently proclaimed himself the movement's only leader. It was a monumental political blunder that very nearly shattered the fragile new alliance between the various factions of the struggle. Within hours, he retracted his statement. Like it or not, this is democracy. No Democrat can pretend otherwise. Day after day, hundreds of thousands of people swarm around places that hold terrible memories for them. They demolish bunkers, break through cordons of concertina wire, and stare straight down the barrels of soldiers' machine guns, saying what very few people in India want to hear. Hum kya chahte? Azadi. We want freedom. And it has to be said in equal numbers and with equal intensity, Jeeve Jeeve Pakistan, long live Pakistan. That sound reverberates through the valley like the drumbeat of steady rain on a tin roof, like the roll of thunder during an electric storm. It's the plebiscite that was never held, the referendum that has been infinitely postponed. On August 15th, India's Independence Day, the city of Srinagar shut down completely. It always shuts down completely. The Bakshi Stadium, where the governor hoisted the flag, was empty except for a few officials. Hours later, Lal Chowk, the nerve center of the city, where in 1992, a BJP leader and mentor of the controversial Hinduization of children's textbooks started a tradition of flag hoisting by the army. That was taken over by thousands of people who hoisted the Pakistani flag and wished each other happy belated Independence Day, because Pakistan celebrates independence on August 14th, and happy Slavery Day. Humor obviously has survived India's many torture centers and Abu Ghraibs in Kashmir. On August 16th, hundreds of thousands of people marched to Pampore, to the village of the leader Sheikh Abdul Aziz, who was shot down in cold blood 5 days earlier. He was part of a massive march to the line of control, demanding that since the Jammu road had been blocked, it was only logical that the Srinagar-Muzaffarabad highway be opened for goods and people, the way it used to be before Kashmir was partitioned. On August 18th, hundreds of thousands also gathered in Srinagar in the huge TRC grounds. That's the Tourist Reception Center, not the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, close to the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, to submit a memorandum asking for three things: the end to Indian rule, the deployment of a UN peacekeeping force, and an investigation into 2 decades of war crimes committed with almost complete impunity by the Indian Army and police. The day before the rally, the deep state was hard at work. A senior journalist friend called to say that late in the afternoon, the Home Secretary had called a meeting in New Delhi. Also present were the Defense Secretary and intelligence chiefs. The purpose of the meeting, he said, was to brief the editors of TV news channels that the government had reason to believe that the insurrection was being managed by a small splinter cell of the Pakistani intelligence, and to request the channels to keep this piece of exclusive, highly secret intelligence in mind while covering, or preferably not covering, the news from Kashmir. On the night of August 17th, the police sealed the city. Streets were barricaded, thousands of armed police manned the barriers. The roads leading to Srinagar were blocked. For the first time in 18 years, the police had to plead with the pro-independence leaders to address the rally at the TRC grounds instead of marching right up to the UN office on Gupkar Road, which is Srinagar's green zone, where for years the Indian establishment has barricaded itself in style and splendor. On the morning of the 18th, people began pouring into Srinagar from villages and towns across the valley, in trucks, jeeps, buses, and on foot. The police were faced with the choice of either stepping aside or executing a massacre. They stepped aside. Not a single bullet was fired. The city floated on a sea of smiles. There was ecstasy in the air. Everyone had a banner: houseboat owners, traders, students, lawyers, doctors. One said, "We are all prisoners, set us free." Another said, "Democracy without justice is demon crazy." Demon crazy, that was a good one. Perhaps he was referring to the twisted logic of a country that needed to commit communal carnage in order to bolster its secular credentials, or the insanity that prevents the world's largest democracy to administer the world's largest military occupation and continue to call itself a democracy. All the world's military occupations are administered by democracies. Have you noticed? Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kashmir, except Tibet. There was a green flag on every lamppost, every roof, every bus stop, and on the top of chinar trees. A big one fluttered outside the All India Radio building. Road signs to Hazratbal, Batmalu, Sopur were painted over. Rawalpindi, they said, or simply Pakistan. It would be a mistake to assume that the public expression of affection for Pakistan automatically translates into a desire to accede to Pakistan. Some of it has to do with gratitude for the support, cynical or otherwise, for what Kashmiris see as their freedom struggle, and the Indian state sees as a terrorist campaign. It also has to do with mischief, with saying and doing what galls India most of all. It's easy to scoff at the idea of a freedom struggle that wishes to distance itself from a country that's supposed to be a democracy and align itself with another that has, for the most part, been ruled by military dictators. A country whose army has committed genocide in what is now Bangladesh. A country that is even now being torn apart by its own ethnic war. These are important questions, but right now perhaps it's more useful to wonder what this so-called democracy did in Kashmir to make people hate it so. Everywhere there were Pakistani flags, everywhere the cry, "Pakistan se rishta kya, la ilaha illallah." What's our bond with Pakistan? There is no God but Allah. Azadi ka matlab kya, la ilaha illallah. What does freedom mean? There is no God but Allah. For someone like myself who's not a Muslim, that interpretation of freedom is hard, if not impossible, to understand. I asked a young woman whether freedom for Kashmir would not mean less freedom for her as a woman. She shrugged and said, "What kind of freedom do we have now? The freedom to be raped by Indian soldiers?" Her reply silenced me. Standing in the grounds of the TRC, surrounded by a sea of green flags, it was impossible to doubt or ignore the deeply Islamic nature of the uprising taking place around me. It was equally impossible to label it a vicious terrorist jihad. For Kashmiris, it was a catharsis, a historical moment in a long and complicated struggle for freedom, with all the imperfections, cruelties, and confusions that freedom struggles have. This one cannot by any means call itself pristine, and will always be stigmatized by, and will someday, I hope, have to account for, among other things, the brutal killing of Kashmiri Pandits in the early years of the uprising, culminating in the exodus of almost the entire community from the Kashmir Valley. As the crowd continued to swell, I listened carefully to the slogans, because rhetoric often clarifies things and holds the key to all kinds of understanding. I'd heard many of them before a few years ago at a militant's funeral. A new one, obviously coined after the blockade, was Kashmir ki mandi, Rawalpindi. It doesn't lend itself to translation, but means Kashmir's marketplace, Rawalpindi. Another was Khuni lakir tod do, ar par jod do. Break down the blood-soaked line of control and let Kashmir be united again. There were plenty of insults and humiliation for India. E Jabiro, e Zalimo, Kashmir hamara chhod do. O oppressors, O wicked ones, get out of our Kashmir. Jis Kashmir ko khoon se siicha, wo Kashmir hamara hai. The Kashmir we have irrigated with our blood, that Kashmir is ours. But the slogan that cut through me like a knife and clean broke my heart was this one: Nanga bhuka Hindustan, jaan se pyara Pakistan. Naked, starving India, more precious than life itself, Pakistan. Why was it so galling, so painful to listen to this? I tried to work it out and settled on 3 reasons. First, because we all know that the first part of the slogan is the embarrassing and unadorned truth about India, the emerging superpower. Second, because all Indians who are not Nanga or Bhuka, not naked and hungry, have been complicit in complex and historical ways with the elaborate cultural and economic systems that make Indian society so cruel, so vulgarly unequal. And third, because it was painful to listen to people who have suffered so much themselves mock others who suffer in different ways, but no less intensely under the same oppressor. In that slogan, I saw the seeds of how easily victims can become perpetrators. It took hours for Mirwais Umar Farooq and Saeed Ali Shah Gilani to wade through the thronging crowds and make it onto the podium. When they arrived, they were borne aloft on the shoulders of young men over the surging crowd to the podium. The roar of greeting was deafening. Mirwais Umar spoke first. He repeated the demand that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Disturbed Areas Act, and the Public Safety Act, under which thousands have been killed, jailed, and tortured, be withdrawn. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which applies all over Kashmir and all over the Northeast, allows non-commissioned officers to kill on sight. This is our democracy. He called for the release of political prisoners, for the Srinagar-Muzaffarabad road to be opened for the free movement of goods and people, and for the demilitarization of the Kashmir Valley. Saeed Ali Shah Gilani began his address with the recitation from the Quran. He then said what he has said before on hundreds of occasions. The only way for the struggle to succeed, he said, was to turn to the Quran for guidance. He said Islam would guide the struggle and that it was a complete social and moral code that would govern the people of a free Kashmir. He said Pakistan had been created as the home of Islam and that goal should never be subverted. He said, just as Pakistan belonged to Kashmir, Kashmir belonged to Pakistan. He said minority communities would have their full rights and their places of worship would be safe. Each point he made was applauded. But oddly enough, the apparent doctrinal clarity of what he said made everything a little unclear. I wondered how the somewhat disparate views of the various factions in this freedom struggle would resolve themselves. The Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front's vision of an independent state, Gilani's desire to merge with Pakistan, and Mirwais Umar balanced precariously beneath them. An old man with a red eye standing next to me said, Kashmir was one country. Half was taken by India, the other half by Pakistan, both by force. We want freedom. I wondered if in the new dispensation, the old man would get a hearing. I wondered what he would think of the trucks that roared down the highways in the plains of India, owned and driven by men who knew nothing of history or of Kashmir, but still had slogans on their tailgates that said, Doodh mango to kheer denge, Kashmir mango to cheer denge. Ask for milk and you'll get cream. Ask for Kashmir and we'll cut you open. Briefly, I had another thought. I imagined myself standing in the heart of a Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh or Vishwa Hindu Parishad rally. These are the sort of fascist Hindu guilds which are the guiding light of the BJP, which is the right-wing opposition in India. And it was being addressed by L.K. Advani. Replace the word Islam with the word Hindutva. Replace the word Pakistan with Hindustan. Replace the sea of green flags with saffron ones, and we would have the BJP's nightmare vision of an ideal India. Is that what we should accept as our future? Monolithic religious states handing down a complete social and moral code, a complete way of life. Millions of us in India reject the Hindutva project, and our rejection springs from love, from passion, from a kind of idealism, from having enormous stakes in the society in which we live. What our neighbors do and how they choose to handle their affairs does not affect our argument, it only strengthens it. Arguments that spring from love are often fraught with danger. It is for the people of Kashmir to agree or disagree with the Islamic project, which is as contested in equally complex ways all over the world by Muslims as Hindutva is contested by Hindus. Perhaps now that the threat of violence has receded and there is some space in which to debate views and air ideas, it's time for those who are part of the struggle to outline a vision for what kind of society they are fighting for. Perhaps it's time to offer people something more than martyrs, slogans, and vague generalizations. Those who wish to turn to the Quran for guidance will no doubt find guidance there. But what of those who do not wish to do that, or for whom the Quran does not make place? Do the Hindus of Jammu and other minorities also have the right to self-determination? Will the hundreds of thousands of Kashmiri Pandits living in exile, many of them in terrible poverty, have the right to return? Will they be paid reparations for the terrible losses they have suffered? Or will a free Kashmir do to its minorities what India has done to Kashmir for 61 years? What will happen to homosexuals and adulterers and blasphemers? What of thieves and writers who do not agree with the complete social and moral code? Will we be put to death as we are in Saudi Arabia? Will the cycle of death, repression, and bloodshed continue? History offers many models for Kashmir's thinkers and intellectuals and politicians to study. What will the Kashmir of their dreams look like? Algeria, Iran, South Africa, Switzerland, Pakistan. At a crucial time like this, few things are more important than dreams. A lazy utopia and a flawed sense of justice will have consequences that do not bear thinking about. This is not the time for intellectual sloth or a reluctance to assess a situation clearly and honestly. It could be argued that the prevarication of the Maharaja Hari Singh in 47 has been its great modern tragedy, one that eventually led to unthinkable bloodshed and the prolonged bondage of people who were very nearly free. Already the specter of partition has reared its head. Hindutva networks are alive with rumors about Hindus in the valley being attacked and forced to flee. In response, phone calls from Jammu report that an armed Hindu militia was threatening massacre and that Muslims from 2 Hindu-majority districts were preparing to flee. There's absolutely no reason to believe that history will repeat itself, not unless it's made to, not unless people actively work to create such a cataclysm. However, none of these fears of what the future holds can justify the continued military occupation of a nation and a people, no more than the old colonial argument about how natives were not ready for freedom justified the colonial project. Of course, there are many ways for the Indian state to continue to hold on to Kashmir. It could do what it does best, wait and hope that people's energies will dissipate in the absence of a concrete plan. It could fracture the fragile coalition that is emerging. It could extinguish this nonviolent uprising and reinvite armed militancy. It could increase the number of troops from 500,000 to 250,000. A few strategic massacres, a couple of targeted assassinations, some disappearances, and a massive round of arrests should do the trick for a few more years. The unimaginable sums of public money that are needed to keep the military occupation of Kashmir going ought by right to be spent instead on schools and hospitals and food for an impoverished, malnutrition population in India. What kind of government can possibly believe that it has a right to spend it on more weapons, more concertina wire, and more prisons in Kashmir? The Indian military occupation of Kashmir makes monsters of us all. It allows Hindu chauvinists to target and victimize Muslims in India by holding them hostage to the freedom struggle being waged by Muslims in Kashmir. It's all been stirred into a poisonous brew and administered intravenously straight into our bloodstream. At the heart of it all is a moral question. Does any government have the right to take away people's liberty with military force? India needs Azadi from Kashmir just as much, if not more, than Kashmir needs Azadi from India. And I think that would apply to Afghanistan and Iraq and Palestine too. Thank you.